Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another discussion on the Matt Goodwin Substack. And I couldn't think, to be honest, of a better topic than what we're going to be talking about today, which is inside the UK's free speech crisis. Because as we're having this conversation, the US State Department in America has actually just issued a pretty stern and vocal warning about the state of free speech in the UK. They've actually said that human rights are worsening in the UK largely because of the free speech situation. And this report, a bombshell report from the State Department, specifically points to the erosion of free speech after the Southport attacks, where, of course, we saw people like Lucy Connolly sent to prison for nearly 3 years because of what they put in a tweet and later took down. It looks at online crackdowns on free speech through the Online Safety Act that we'll be talking about today. And it also looks at the clampdowns on protesters silently praying outside of abortion clinics. And it doesn't really mince its words. So I've obviously been interested in the free speech issue. We've written a lot about the threats to free speech from the new Islamophobia law. We haven't talked too much about the Online Safety Act, but we'll be filling that hole today. And we've talked about the creeping expansion of things like non-crime hate incidents, which have also been used to try and control the national debate and try and suppress free speech in the UK. And I genuinely could not think of anybody better to talk about these issues with us than Lord Young from the Free Speech Union, also editor in chief and writer at the Daily Skeptic. Many of you will know Lord Young because of his prominence in the mainstream media, because of his contributions to this debate. I have been a very keen supporter of the Free Speech Union for a long time. I've said before, I think it is the single most impactful organisation in the UK, especially in terms of defending and advancing people's free speech and pushing back against basically totalitarianism. So today in this discussion, what we're going to do is go round really the landscape and look at the threats to free speech, what they look like, and crucially, what we can do to actually reassert free speech and free expression in the UK. So, Lord Young, it's great to have you with us. Thank you for giving up your time. Thank you for joining us. Let's just start with this US State Department report, which has come out and said, look, free speech in the UK is being eroded following interventions from Vice President J.D. Vance and, of course, Donald Trump himself. And we saw Keir Starmer denying all of this when he was in the Oval Office in the White House a few months ago. I mean, what's your initial reaction to the US State Department report when it comes to this free speech restriction in the UK?
Well, I was pleased to see the US State Department make note of the various ways in which free speech is being eroded in the UK, drawing attention to some of the things you've mentioned. In addition, the increasing prevalence of public space protection orders. These are bans imposed by local councils. So, funnily enough, I was in Thanet yesterday because the Free Speech Union is challenging an effort by Thanet to pass a public space protection order banning swearing in public places, banning what it calls foul and abusive language, although that has no legal definition, and we're worried, amongst other things, that that could be interpreted arbitrarily and enforced in a biased way, but also banning meetings of two or more people, banning humiliating or degrading behaviour in public places, which we think could include taking the mickey. I mean, it's a ludicrously broadly drafted, cack-handedly drafted public space protection order, and will mean that lots of ordinary people in Thanet, in Margate, in Ramsgate, will find themselves being slapped with these £100 fines. You stub your toe and swear involuntarily in Margate, you could be faced with a £100 fine. It's absolutely ludicrous. But I was very pleased to see that public space protection orders were singled out by the State Department as one of the ways in which the free speech of British citizens is being increasingly fettered. They also drew attention, as you say, to the creation of safe access zones, buffer zones around abortion clinics, and the prosecution of people for silently praying in those buffer zones. They mentioned the Online Safety Act, the increasing arrest and in some cases prosecution of people for so-called disinformation or hate speech, particularly in connection with mass uncontrolled immigration in the wake of the Southport riots. So a lot of the things that the Free Speech Union has been highlighting, campaigning against, have now been highlighted by the US State Department as real threats to free speech in the UK. So I think that's overall very helpful.
So the argument from number 10, particularly from the Keir Starmer administration, would be, well, a lot of this is being inflated essentially by right-wing culture warriors, conservatives, and that actually, we are facing a never-ending war of misinformation that we need to tackle. I would argue that the evidence for this free speech crisis is now overwhelming, and we'll get into the numbers around non-crime hate incidents and look at the new Islamophobia laws. But you must have been lobbying number 10. You must have been pressing the government on these issues. I know you were very active, for example, with the Higher Education Free Speech Act, which was an attempt to reassert free speech on university campuses. I know you were lobbying people like Bridget Phillipson, the Labour education minister. What is the response that you often get back at the Free Speech Union from Labour ministers when you're pointing out that we do have a free speech crisis, as the Americans say?
They oscillate between poo-pooing the idea that we are in the midst of a free speech crisis and claim it's just a right-wing culture warrior trope disseminated by The Spectator and The Telegraph and GB News. And then in the next breath, they'll then say, but then we should be clamping down more on misinformation, disinformation and hate speech. So what we're doing to try and eliminate that toxic, harmful speech, particularly online, should be applauded. So that's often this kind of two-faced response. First of all, you're making it up, nothing to see here. And secondly, yes, we are more censorial, and quite right too.
Yeah, well, exactly. And we've seen, for example, after Southport, which is what the Americans point to, one of the things that struck me was we saw Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper come out in the immediate aftermath and say, look, this is misinformation. Everybody's far right, or lots of people who are engaging in these protests are far right. And then we saw Yvette Cooper come out publicly and say, well, she wants to expand the use of non-crime hate incidents, which, if you don't know what those are, to people watching or listening, a non-crime hate incident is if somebody perceives, say, me to have said something offensive and they contact the police without even having to give the police any evidence, they can file a non-crime hate incident against me, which will then go on my record. And should I want to get a job, say, in a public sector organization, that would show up on an enhanced security check. So these things are very real. And the justification for a lot of that was that, well, the protests were driven by the far right. But since then, we've had the police constabulary reports, among others, that have shown quite clearly that there was no organised far right element to the Southport protests, despite what Keir Starmer and Labour tried to say. Yet they still used it to push forward with this continued crackdown on free speech.
Yes. One of the curiosities, if you follow the free speech argument, is that those in authority who accuse their political opponents of trafficking in misinformation are actually, by describing what their opponents are saying as misinformation, trafficking in misinformation themselves. But a good example of something like this was, as you say, during the disturbances that followed the Southport attack, the line taken by Sir Keir Starmer and other people in authority was that what's fomenting this unrest is not widespread public anger about mass uncontrolled immigration, about the number of small boats arriving on our shores every day, about asylum hotels being placed in residential communities, in some cases next to primary schools. That's not what's fueling roiling public anger. No, it's all been whipped up by bad actors on social media and far-right agitators coming into the area from outside. That last claim in particular, which, as you say, there's no evidence to support at all, that last claim was, I think, a piece of disinformation. Disinformation is misinformation, which actually causes harm and which is known to be false when it's disseminated. I mean, I don't think the government had any evidence for this. So at the very least, they were being reckless when they made that charge. And the reason I say it was harmful is because in lots of communities, gangs of young Muslim men organised to protect, quote unquote, their communities from these outside far-right agitators supposedly coming into their communities to whip up protests and to set fire to mosques and so on and so forth. Given that, these mobs of young Muslim men often fermented disorder themselves, went round, beat people up suspected of being outside far-right agitators, in one case attacked a pub, terrorised the people inside the pub. This was, if we can, I mean, in a sense, Sir Keir Starmer himself should be prosecuted for trafficking in harmful misinformation, namely that accusation, which actually did, I think, whip up and prolong the social unrest.
Well, it wasn't only Keir Starmer, of course. I remember the head or former head of Hope Not Hate, Nick Lowles, claiming that somebody had thrown acid, I think, in the face of a Muslim woman or in the direction of a Muslim woman, and that had gone viral. It turned out that was not true, and of course that was used, some people might say, allegedly, insert all of the caveats, to try and whip up more civil unrest and so on. Now, that individual had no consequences as far as I'm aware, while somebody like Lucy Connolly went to prison for nearly 3 years for saying something not entirely dissimilar. But the thing that struck me about post Southport, given all that we know now, is at the very same time Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper were sort of making those very, some would say authoritarian speeches, kind of stern words, and decrying misinformation. At the very same time, we know now that they knew that the state at that moment was importing thousands of Afghans while gagging the press through a super injunction and not telling their own citizens, the British people, what had been going on. And there were even people at that time saying, well, where are all these Afghans coming from in my community? And so, I mean, I would argue, this is more of a political point, but the biggest exercise in misinformation that we've seen in this country has actually been orchestrated and delivered by the British state, which was the Afghan scandal, which I think we can call it, whereby the state was complicit in basically gagging the press, shutting down free speech, importing dangerous people who we now know have included members of the Taliban, while refusing to tell anybody about it. Now, is that misinformation? Is that just a state cover-up? I'm not sure what the difference is anymore, but that was what was remarkable to me now, looking back at Keir Starmer. He knew all of that while he was giving those speeches after Southport.
Yeah, I think it's illustrative of the weakness in the government's analysis of what is or is likely to cause community tensions which might erupt in social unrest. The argument that was made, I think, to the High Court about why the information that Afghans were supposedly being given safe harbour here after their names had been leaked by the Ministry of Defence to, in effect, the Taliban, Afghans who'd cooperated with the British Armed Forces during the Iraq War and its aftermath. You have to suppress this information because if it gets out, it will foment social unrest. As if, the real cause of the unrest likely to be triggered, as if the real cause wasn't the fact that they were importing all these Afghans and placing them in asylum hotels. It's a bit like an adulterer, who is being flagrantly unfaithful, blaming not the fact if his marriage then collapses when his wife finds out, he doesn't take any responsibility for his own behaviour. He simply blames the person who told his wife. It's bizarre. It's as though the government thinks it's perfectly okay to import any number of foreign nationals, regardless of their criminal record, regardless of whether they're likely to pose a threat, particularly to women and girls. It's all fine. That's not going to foment social unrest. That's not going to cause public anger. That's not going to exacerbate community tensions. But the moment people draw attention to it, the moment people are allowed to talk about it, then it becomes a problem. I mean, it's a ludicrous kind of superficial diagnosis of the real causes of public anger about the extent of migration, particularly illegal migration into this country.
I want to come on to the Islamophobia law, but just before we do, the other case that struck me recently were the authorities in Nuneaton, who pretty openly said, actually, after it had been discovered that a schoolgirl had been sexually assaulted and raped by migrants, the authorities basically openly said, look, we don't want to report the fact that this involved asylum seekers because we are worried about community tensions. And that was the phrase they used, that sort of, familiar and ominous phrase, we are worried about community tensions, which, as you say, is often used or is often prioritized above the truth. And what struck me about this is, this is exactly the same logic that was used during the rape gang scandal and that was used to basically ignore and deflect away from that scandal, for 30 years. I mean, well done on Andrew Norfolk, the Times journalist who got there in 2011. But, there are reports of that scandal from as early as the 1980s. And the argument often used was, well, this will ignite community tension. So I was struck that even now, a year on from Southport, the same arguments are being used that were used to downplay the rape gang scandal. And only this week, as you and I are talking in early August 2025, the police have come out and said they are now going to release the ethnicity and migration status of suspects and offenders when these cases come to the surface. It's taken them more than a year after the Southport incident to actually be forced into that position. So why is it, do you think, that the institutions are still so cack-handed and woeful when it comes to this issue?
Yeah, I think not disclosing the identity of the Southport attacker straight away was a real mistake. The government blames bad actors on social media for fomenting unrest by blaming the Southport attack on an undocumented migrant, when in fact it wasn't carried out by an undocumented migrant. But that information was allowed to proliferate because it was filling a vacuum left by the government's refusal to say who the attacker actually was. I think there are two things going on here, Matt. The first is that the government, for just kind of cynical, self-interested political reasons, wants to suppress any discussion that they think will make the government itself unpopular. It's just a straightforward attempt to suppress dissent, suppress criticism, because they think it might hurt them at the ballot box at the next general election, particularly when it comes to embarrassing national scandals like the Afghan scandal. But I think there's something else going on too, which is I think amongst our liberal elites, they've lost faith in a lot of their fundamental ideological political philosophy. They've lost faith in liberalism itself, and they've lost faith in many of the facets of liberalism, such as multiculturalism. They've lost faith in mass immigration as a source of cultural enrichment. And it's happened almost overnight. For years we've been told diversity is our strength. Mass immigration is enriching our culture in untold ways. It's enabling us to support older members of society who are no longer in the labour force. For years, kind of enumerating the various ways in which we benefit from mass immigration, talking up multiculturalism, smearing anyone who has reservations about it as far right, as bigoted, as xenophobic, racist, the rest of it. But overnight, seemingly, they have lost their faith in multiculturalism. And now, on the liberal left, particularly within the Labour Party, there is, I think, this fear that through mass uncontrolled immigration over several decades, Britain's towns and cities are now tinderboxes that may explode at any moment. And their job now is to keep the lid on those
Yeah.
tinderboxes. And they think the only way to do that is to stop people saying how they really feel stop members of different communities saying how they really feel about the other communities. They do this through recording non-crime hate incidents. They're doing it by trying to come up with a definition of Islamophobia and prohibit criticism of Islam. They see things like the outbreak of sectarian race riots in cities like Leicester between, Hindus and Muslims. They see that as our future unless they can somehow keep a very tight lid on what people are allowed to say in these communities about each other. But that seems to me, it's not a long-term solution to the problems that multiculturalism has created. If we're going to forge a new common British identity, a sense of Britishness that transcends the fact that we are now a multi-ethnic, multi-faith society, a multicultural society. If we're going to forge a common sense of identity in spite of all these differences, we can only do that by having open and honest conversations, by negotiating with each other in the public square. We can't do it by silencing everybody and keeping a lid on what people really think. That's not a long-term solution. Free speech, more free speech, not less free speech, is the way to make these cities work, to help communities with very different values live together. We can't do it by, forcing each community to respect the other community's blasphemy codes, which is what the attempt to define Islamophobia is all
Well,
about.
just before we come to that, because I do want to ask you about the role of Islam in all of this, because you look at the forecast. I mean, we've released a forecast on the Substack. By the end of this century, we are looking at somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 3 people in this country following Islam by the year 2100, which I think is going to have profound consequences, especially for free speech. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But let me just go back to what you said, because I think psychology and the psychology of what we might call the radical progressives actually has a lot to say about this. I just finished a book by Luke Conway, who's a professor of psychology, and the book is called Liberal Bullies. And Luke Conway is sort of a disgruntled, disillusioned member of that group. So he's, the title is provocative, but he's very much, I think, still on their side. And what he argues is, if you go back half a century in social science, we've had a whole literature on right-wing authoritarians, which was based on a particular scale that was used in surveys to identify these authoritarians, and basically was used by university academics to say the right-wing are authoritarian, the left-wing are not. And what Luke Conway does in this book, I summarized it on the Substack, is he says actually this scale is biased. The scale that they use for this is biased, and he corrects it and he balances it. And he said, if you ask people the same questions about the left and the right, what you find, and I think this is at the root of everything we talk about really when it comes to free speech and Keir Starmer and Labour, he says what he finds is that people on the left, a subset of the left, are more authoritarian than people on the right. That there is a group on the left that are so quick to be dogmatic, to shut down free speech, to basically impose their will in a very totalitarian way. And he says it's especially visible on speech and communication. And I don't know if it's true that, let's say, I don't want to pick on people, but James O'Brien or Emily Maitlis have really changed their views or accepted that mass immigration isn't working. I think it's actually rather different. I think they are blind to anything that undermines the project in their mindset. And so their instinctive reaction is just to say, well, I'm going to keep imposing my will, imposing my view. You're just a horrible racist. I'm not even going to enter into this conversation. I'm not going to have a good faith discussion with you. I'm just going to shut down and impose my will. And that's what Conway says defines these progressives: binary thinking, an inability to consider nuance and compromise. And you see it with Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer is the, symbolic progressive, completely unable to sort of relate to the human being on any level beyond the kind of, human right law, my way or the highway. And I just wonder, if that psychology maybe has a bit more to play in some of this.
Yeah, I think that's 75% of the explanation for why the impulse on the part of the Emily Maitlis's and Sir Keir Starmers of this world is to shut down dissent rather than engage with it. I think it's an authoritarian impulse, but I don't think it's because they haven't changed their minds exactly. I think that one of the reasons they're so quick to kind of reach for the censorship button is because deep down, maybe only semi-consciously, but deep down, they recognise that the liberal arguments they relied on to justify these policies are quite hard to defend. I think they have begun to lose their faith, and blaming social disorder on misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech, rather than the failure of those policies that they've been advocating and defending for decades. It's a way of avoiding confronting that policy failure. And they want to avoid it, not because they're so convinced that they're right, they won't brook any opposition. I think it's almost at the same time, if that's possible, the suspicion that they could be wrong, but they want to do anything to avoid confronting that failure themselves.
Yeah,
they don't want to admit
that.
they're wrong, so they lash out instead. And I think one of the reasons censorship has got so much worse in the past decade or so, not just in the UK, but across the continent, also in the rest of the English-speaking world, is that these regimes that have effectively been in power for so long are becoming increasingly brittle as they've begun to lose their kind of underlying faith in liberalism. And as they become increasingly brittle, so they become more and more likely to lash out. I think historically you see, as regimes begin to teeter, as they begin to lose faith in their fundamental sacred values, so they're much more likely to become authoritarian, to lash out, to try and suppress dissent, jail people who come up with unwelcome, inconvenient truths in the public square.
Yeah.
That's, I think, what's going on. It's a symptom of the kind of sclerotic decline of these regimes. Deep down, I think they know that they're kind of running on fumes. It's not because their faith remains as fundamentally fixed as it's always been. It's because it's beginning to disappear that they're becoming more and more authoritarian.
Can I just move? Well, probably a good moment to move on to the issue of Islamophobia, because if there's one thing in British society, UK society, I'm most concerned about, it's actually this new plan to install a definition of Islamophobia within our institutions. Now, even though the Labour working group behind this, and we've been tracking this on the stack, has said, look, it's not going to be a sort of legally binding definition. We all know what happens when public sector institutions decide that this is the way, the whole system gets shaped around it. Could you just explain to our viewers and listeners why this definition is so problematic? And also the process itself, because one thing I've pointed out is that many of the people involved in this process are themselves deeply problematic. And the second thing I've noted is a lack of consultation beyond a closed network of Labour allies. Why is this push for Islamophobia so insidious?
Well, this is the second attempt to define Islamophobia and embed it in speech codes across our public bodies, including schools and universities. The first attempt was in 2018, when the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims came up with an incredibly broad and vague definition of Islamophobia, which it equated with racism. And it included things like drawing attention to the overrepresentation of Muslims in rape gangs. That was an example of Islamophobia. And indeed, many of the brave MPs and journalists who did raise the alarm about the rape gangs years ago were branded Islamophobes, partly from people drawing on this all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims definition. It effectively said that any criticism of the religion of Islam is Islamophobic. It even said that historians drawing attention to historical episodes in which Islam has been imposed at the tip of a sword on conquered populations, that was Islamophobic, even though we know that actually happened in several instances. So we started out, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, with this unbelievably broad definition of Islamophobia, which was adopted by the Labour Party. It was adopted, I think, by the Greens. Trevor Phillips was suspended from the Labour Party for breaching this definition of Islamophobia in 2020. It was even adopted by the Scottish Conservatives, and it was adopted by many local authorities, Labour-controlled local authorities, even some Conservative-controlled local authorities, but many Labour-controlled local authorities in those cities and towns which were the most affected by rape gangs. And I think very much played a part in inhibiting the authorities from doing more about the operation of these gangs in those localities.
And Toby, if I just ask you to pause just there, because the other thing about that report I remember is, firstly, Dominic Grieve wrote the foreword to that, the guy who is so committed to free speech, he spent years trying to overturn the Brexit vote. But more fundamentally, that report, what struck me as a social scientist as well, is it said talking about the demographic threat posed by Islam to Western societies would be Islamophobic. So if you and I had a conversation about the fact that, let's say, a third of Sweden is projected to be Muslim by midway through this century, and we presented this as being problematic, maybe we said, well, this is going to pose a threat to Western values, because Islam does not believe in a separation of church and the state, or it might pose a threat to women's rights. We would be considered Islamophobic for talking about the demographic aspect. And secondly, it also talked about entryism. Mentioning entryism would be considered Islamophobic. So if you have sectarian MPs or a campaign group like Muslim Votes, which is clearly trying to organise British politics along the lines of religion, telling 4 million Muslim voters how to vote, that would be Islamophobic. So the reason I keep talking about this is because if this definition were actually enacted over the next 25, 50 years, discussing the creeping influence of Islam on British society would be basically shut down.
Yes. And even though, as you say, the working group of which Dominic Grieve is the chair, the working group that's been empowered by the Deputy Prime Minister to define Islamophobia, even though they've said our definition is going to be non-statutory, it's not going to be embedded in criminal law, it could quite easily be taken up by Ofcom, and Ofcom could penalise you on GB News talking about demographic change being brought about by high birth rates in Muslim communities, high levels of migration from Muslim majority countries. That could be incorporated in the broadcasting code by Ofcom, and GB News could be fined, could be shut down for talking about these things, even though the definition is quote unquote non-statutory. So what's happening is that this working group has been set up by Angela Rayner and asked within a very short period of time, by September of this year, to come up with a definition of Islamophobia / anti-Muslim hatred. As you say, when they initially invited people to respond and suggest whether a definition was necessary, if they thought it is necessary, what to include in it, and so forth. They initially went out to a hand-picked select group of activists who they knew ahead of time would agree with them. It was as though they had a conclusion in mind and they just decided to consult with those people they knew would agree with it. The Free Speech Union threatened the working group with a lawsuit if they didn't broaden the consultation. We said it was unlawful for the consultation to be confined to such a narrow, hand-picked group of consultees. And they then broadened the consultation and invited everyone to respond to what they called their call for evidence. But they gave them only a very short time in which to do so. The Free Speech Union got in under the wire, and you can read our submission to the group on our website. And I think other people did manage to get in under the wire as well. But we're not convinced that the way they've gone about it, even having revised how they've gone about it in response to our legal threat, is lawful. And we will, I think, have more to say about that in due course. But the worry is that the definition they'll land on, and which they'll recommend Angela Rayner take up and then roll out across public bodies, will be similar, if not identical, to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims definition, and it will have a chilling effect on free speech, even though it is it's intended to be quote unquote non-statutory. And even if in the first instance it is non-statutory, it isn't embedded in criminal law. I mean, who's to say in due course it won't be? And as you say, Yvette Cooper has already said she wants the police to record more, not less, more non-crime hate incidents. And she singled out Islamophobia as an example of the kind of speech that she thinks should be recorded by the police as non-crime hate incidents. So as soon as this definition has been landed on, you can bet your bottom dollar that a lot of people are going to find themselves with NCHIs recorded against their name for being in breach of, for falling foul of this new definition.
But do you remember Yvette Cooper as being this sort of, some people might say, authoritarian in earlier years? Because I've been quite taken aback at just how she's managed the Home Office and managed her job as Home Secretary under Keir Starmer, because she's often almost gone further than Starmer with this sort of clampdown on free speech. And I've been quite surprised, because during the 2010s, many people said, look, Yvette Cooper is very competent. You know, this is going to be a competent Home Secretary. But all we've seen, I would argue, from the Home Office for much of the last year is endless gaslighting, misleading the British people, lying to the British people, calling the Rwanda plan a gimmick, and then coming in with the one in, one out scheme, trying to basically mislead the British people on the small boat crisis, saying the number of asylum hotels are coming down. That's because they're putting people into private housing. They're hiding them in the welfare regime. I mean, I'm just curious as to what your impression is of Yvette Cooper with the non-crime hate incidents and and also clearly being on board with this free speech crackdown.
I think she's probably always been quite illiberal, quite intolerant of dissent. I remember debating her husband, Ed Balls, on Newsnight when he was, I think, the Secretary of State at the Department for Children, Schools and Families, debating free schools. At the time, I was advocating for the free schools policy. Labour were bitterly opposed to it, and we had a discussion on Newsnight about it. And he said to me afterwards, I hope my wife hasn't caught that. She'd absolutely kill me for being willing to debate you. I was like, wow, that's pretty severe.
I believe, yeah. I believe she may have unfollowed me on X recently, but there we are. The other thing I just want to talk to you about, because this seems central to the free speech, or the war on free speech, is the Online Safety Act, because there's been considerable discussion about it in recent weeks. And you were one of the people who was first out the gate saying, look, this is going to be a massive problem for British society, even before it had been passed, even before it had come into law. So can you just talk to us a bit about why the Online Safety Act is proving to be such a problem, and perhaps crucially, given the likely radical political changes,
is a very unwelcome addition to the fetters on our free speech. What it does is it effectively empowers Ofcom, hitherto the broadcast regulator, to regulate social media platforms like X, Facebook, Instagram, as well as search engines and direct messaging apps. It empowers Ofcom to regulate them, and if they fall foul of this new act, Ofcom can fine these companies either £18 million or 10% of their annual global turnover, whichever is the higher. So that's a really significant threat. That's a big stick. So companies like X have been erring on the side of caution in trying to comply with the new regulatory regime. In an earlier iteration of the Act, when it was still a bill going through Parliament, there was a proposal that the Secretary of State at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport should have the power to come up with a list of content that was legal but harmful, and which Ofcom would then have to insist social media platforms remove on pain of being fined as a matter of priority. And various free speech groups, including the Free Speech Union, lobbied against that. We said, surely it's, even the Conservatives can see that's a hostage to fortune. That could be taken advantage of by a politician with a very low regard for free speech to try and suppress political criticism online. And they accepted that argument, and they took that clause out of the Online Safety Bill, as it then was. But they kept in this need to protect children from legal but harmful content. And what we saw happen, I think it was on July 25th, was this part of the Online Safety Act coming into force, whereby social media platforms in particular had to ensure that content that was potentially harmful to children, even if it's perfectly legal, had to be age-gated. You had to be able to prove that you were 18 in order to access it. And of course, they went far further than they needed to do. I mean, I don't think anyone would object if we were just talking about porn or websites promoting suicide or other forms of self-harm, anorexia. But it went far beyond that. And we saw within hours of this new safety duty coming into force, that X began to remove vast swathes of content that couldn't possibly pose any danger to children, like Katie Lamb talking about the grooming gangs in Parliament, video footage of an anti-immigration protester being arrested in Leeds, even a history thread about Richard the Lionheart. I mean, over removal on a colossal scale, just out of a desire not to be fined by the trigger-happy regulator. And we warned about that. We warned that would happen, and lo and behold, that's happened. And my worry, Matt, people talk about, well, how can we improve the Online Safety Act? Can we repeal it? Can we reform it? I think that's in the current political climate a bit naive. Maybe if there's a change of government, we could do something about it. But under the present government, our objective should be to stop it getting worse. And one way in which it could get worse is that clause whereby a senior politician is empowered to direct Ofcom to, as a matter of priority, force social media platforms to remove content that's legal but harmful to adults, could be put back in. So the Parliamentary Select Committee, the Science, Innovation and Technology Committee, recently issued a report about the Southport riots. And it concluded the Online Safety Act doesn't grant Ofcom nearly enough powers to suppress disinformation and hate speech on social media, which clearly played an enormous part in fomenting the unrest which followed the Southport attacks. The Online Safety Act needs to be amended, and this legal but harmful clause needs to be put back in. So the government is coming under pressure, particularly from people on its own side, to make the Online Safety Act even more censorial than it already is. And I wouldn't be surprised if there is an effort to do that in the next Parliament. There'll be something about that, I suspect, in the next King's Speech. That's unfortunately, I thought when I set up the Free Speech Union, Matt, that things had reached such a low point when it came to free speech, had never been more imperiled in this country since the Second World War, that the only way forward was up. It couldn't get worse. our job was to improve things, was to try and repeal some of these draconian laws fettering what we can say in the public square. Actually, things have got a lot worse since then, and I've
Yeah.
realised that our job, our main objective, is just to stop things getting worse, to try and hold back the tide of censorship, and that should be our objective now when it comes to the Online Safety Act.
Well, just on that, because you mentioned, okay, what do we do about all of this? You mentioned a possible change of government. I noticed that Reform came out and said, look, they've just completely squashed the Online Safety Act. I don't think they said anything yet about non-crime hate incidents, Islamophobia, etc., etc. But we are likely to see a change of government if we have an election. The next time we go to the polls. I mean, just putting aside whether it's Reform, whether it's Conservative, whatever, let's assume that there was a pro-free speech government in place. What's on your wish list? What is on the wish list of the Free Speech Union? What's on the wish list of Lord Young when it comes to defending, promoting, and reasserting free speech, free expression, and individual liberty in the UK?
Well, just to start at the bottom of my list, I'd certainly like to see non-crime hate incidents scrapped. And there is a crime and policing bill currently going through Parliament. It's going to be before the House of Lords in the autumn, and I'm going to be proposing an amendment to that bill to scrap non-crime hate incidents. And I know I'll have the backing of the Conservative group in the Lords. I think the Conservative Party has now said we are opposed to non-crime hate incidents, which is a huge step forward. I don't suppose I'll be able to get that amendment through. Even if it does get through in the House of Lords, it'll just be removed from the bill when it goes back to the Commons. But nevertheless, I think it'll be a useful first step in scrapping NCHIs. I think at the moment the Free Speech Union is engaged in a long-term research project to make a list of all those laws that have been passed since the Second World War which fetter our free speech. And one of our proposals to whoever the next government is, assuming it isn't another Labour government or a Labour Lib Dem Green coalition, if it's a Reform government, a Conservative government, or some combination of the two, our proposal is going to be, here are the laws we think you need to repeal. If you want to restore free speech to its rightful place at the heart of our liberal democracy, then these are the laws you need to repeal. But in addition, we think that government needs to pass something like a British version of the First Amendment. And I think that combination, repealing those laws fettering our free speech that have been passed in the past 70 years or so, plus a British First Amendment, I think that could be a powerful combination. Now, of course, there'd be nothing to stop a future parliament from restoring all those fetters on our free speech that government had repealed and repealing the Free Speech Act, which created a British First Amendment. So we also have to think about how we're going to sprinkle the British First Amendment with the kind of political fairy dust, which makes it very difficult for a successor parliament to repeal it, to go back on it. And that isn't impossible. We saw with the Equality Act. I mean, an incredibly left-wing piece of legislation passed in the dying days of the Brown administration. One of its clauses was described by Polly Toynbee, the Guardian columnist, as socialism in one clause. I mean, it absolutely fettered what future governments could do, and essentially kind of tied them to this egalitarian agenda. But none of them had the political balls to repeal it. It's remained on the statute book in spite of 14 years of successive conservative prime ministers. That's because it was sprinkled with a kind of political fairy dust that made it indestructible. So we need to think about how they managed to do that and do the same for any measures passed in by the next government, assuming it isn't another Labour government, to try and defend our free speech. We need to do whatever we can to make it as difficult for it to be reversed by a future parliament as we can.
Well, absolutely. And partly that story about the Equality Act is a story about the left knowing how to use power far more decisively than Conservatives and the right have historically. Now, if there was, let's say the polls are right and there is a Reform government, I would be saying to Nigel Farage and his team, where's the plan for repealing the Equality Act? Where's the plan for overturning things like the Islamophobia definition if it comes into play, for abolishing non-crime hate incidents, for reforming the Human Rights Act? But I think the story here is about returning. Now, I've often talked about this in terms of a factory reset. What I believe this country needs is a factory reset. A smartphone gets overloaded with apps, becomes sluggish. It's a major source of stress. And it's like our country. We need a factory reset that strips away all this crap that's been added on to the phone. You know, the Equality Act, the European Convention on Human Rights, the Human Rights Act. We don't need these things for basic human right protections. They come with a lot of rubbish that's slowed our country down, that's become a major source of stress. So we need a factory reset. But, you know, if I'm right, if the polls are right, and we end up with some kind of reform conservative outcome, whether it's a reform government, reform-led government, whatever, they better have a plan ready to go, because the first 2 years of that administration will be tied up with the Lords. They're going to have to bring constitutional reforms to, I think they will have to take on the Lords if they're going to want to do anything. And then they're going to need a serious plan for how they can reassert our common law tradition, equality before the law, and our status as the home of free speech and individual liberty. And, you know, that plan has got to come soon. So I hope the Free Speech Union you know, is working, as you say. It's great to hear you working on that list. I hope that's getting plugged in to the people who are devising some of the laws and, you know, the legislation. I know that work is now starting to happen to some degree, and I hope the FSU is all over that and leading that work on free speech. Because it seems to me out there, my last comment here is, people out there, when they listen to conversations like this, I think everybody's had enough of the complaining. I think everybody's had enough of like the rage, you know. I think people are like, okay, what is the actual serious policy response, practical response to this? What is going to enable us to save our country, which many people feel and can see that we are losing through this endless top-down authoritarianism, and I think the FSU is one of those organisations that needs to be at the forefront of that.
Well, I very much hope we can play a part in helping the next government, assuming it is a reform, a conservative government, or some combination of the two, to work out how best to restore free speech to its rightful place in our democracy. And I think we will have a plan which we'll be able to hand to that government. But there are two parts to the plan. And you've kind of touched on both parts, but just to make it absolutely clear, it's one thing to come up with a radical reforming agenda and to figure out what policies need to be enacted in order to bring about those reforms. And as you say, there is work that's beginning to be undertaken to come up with that plan, something like Heritage's Project 25, but for Reform or the Conservatives to take up. But there's another part to it too, which is it's all very well having a set of policies, including them in the King's speech, having thought through those policies very carefully. But how are you going to face down the unbelievable opposition there is going to be to a radical reforming government? I mean, let's suppose Nigel Farage is the Prime Minister, Kemi Badenoch is the Deputy Prime Minister, and they say we want to repeal the Human Rights Act, we want to come out of the European Convention on Human Rights, we want to turn back the small boats. They'll be faced with a tsunami of opposition from all those members of our current legal, political, media establishments who have a vested interest in preserving those policies, who have an ideological commitment to those policies. You know, they've been running the place for the past 75 years. They're not going to give up without a fight. They're going to throw every conceivable obstacle into the path of that government. They're going to legally challenge whatever the government does wherever they can. They're going to say to Nigel Farage, if he says, we want to allow fracking again. Well, have you done an environmental impact assessment? Have you done an equality impact assessment? I mean, the number of complexities, the opportunities for the blob to just kind of throw obstacles in the pathway of a radical reforming government, that needs to be understood. That needs to be mastered, because otherwise it'll be an intifada unleashed by the blob on that government. We saw what happened to Liz Truss. Liz Truss had a pretty radical program when it came to the economy, and was ousted, in less than 50 days, because she hadn't thought through properly how to overcome the obstacles that would be thrown in her path, all the political political risks associated with having a radical reforming agenda. So it's all very well to say what you want to do, even to win a majority to supposedly enable you to do it. But that's not enough. We see governments change and they get elected. They find these levers in their departments in Whitehall, they pull the levers and nothing happens because they're not in charge. The blob's in charge. So they need. I hope that Nigel, Kemi, the people around them are thinking very carefully, about how to overcome what will be incredibly challenging obstacles thrown in their way as soon as they're elected.
Well, I think you're spot on, because all the things that we spend a lot of our time talking about, mass immigration, broken borders, the free speech crisis, net zero, these are second order problems. The first order problem is the regime, the establishment, the blob, the bureaucratic state, and whatever comes next in British politics, assuming it's coming from the other side, on the right of the conservative side with a small c. Whatever is coming next, it has to look a lot more like Trump 2 than Trump 1. That, I think, is one of the observations that unifies a lot of people. It has to come with a plan for not just a policy mix, but actually for reconfiguring the state, reconfiguring the organs of the state, and understanding, as you say, that in some ways winning the election is the battle, but the war that will follow will be, it will be grueling. It will be a war of attrition, and it's going to be highly, highly complex, and actually harder than Trump 2, because if it is a reform government, they'll have much less of an ability to make their political appointments. They'll have much less of an ability to impose their executive will. And as you say, I think they will be under fire from all sides. Now, we are talking to a Trump insider next week about how they overcame the problems of Trump 1 to deliver Trump 2. And we'll be following this conversation as we go forward with the stack. But I just wanted to thank you again for joining us today, Lord Young, and thank you for all of the work that you've been doing with the Free Speech Union. And as I mentioned, obviously everybody out there, I hope, is a subscriber to the Free Speech Union. I certainly get the newsletter, which is a crucial source of updates, and as well reading and watching the Daily Skeptic, and of course engaging with Lord Young across social media, because I think this system, or this ecosystem of bringing together people who are doing really important work in different areas, is actually part of that plan to bring about serious change at the next election. So thank you very much for your time today and for laying the issues out so clearly, and also giving us some hope that there is a viable alternative on the way.
Thanks, Matt. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Cheers.